Now we're going to examine some other aspects of vision and go into more detail, especially in terms of form perception. We're going to go through the visual fields and what they are, visual field defects, the what and the where systems in the brain, the clinical phenomenon of visual neglect and the clinical phenomenon of visual agnosia. These represent impairments or disorders of vision that have helped us understand how vision itself works. And they also highlight the what and where systems in the brain and these two major divisions of visual systems in processing visual information. These images show the gross anatomy of the visual system in the brain. The image on the left I showed you before. It's showing you the brain, a lateral view of the brain, with the dura still intact, the brain coverings. In the bottom left there, you see the eyeballs and the optic nerve. So that shows you how the eyes are connected intimately to the brain. The eyes are just a receptor system for the brain. It's your brain that does visual perception. It's your brain that processes the visual information. Most people tend to think of their eyes as being the primary and only organ of vision, but they're just a small part of it, actually. About a third of the back of your brain is devoted to visual perception and processing visual information. Primates are very good at this. Primates use a lot of their brain for processing vision, and it's the primary sensory system that they use. Now, the right image shows the bottom of the brain with the bottom parts dissected away, so it just shows the visual pathways. Now, at the top there, you see there's a optic nerve, and the top part is showing you the eyeballs have been taken away, and it's just showing where they're attached at the top. It looks kind of like a wishbone there. Well, the optic nerves flare back to the lateral geniculate body of the thalamus, and then there's synapses there, and then there are neurons that go back from the lateral geniculate body. They flare around the ventricles of the brain. The ventricles are the fluid-filled spaces of the brain. They flare around them and go back to the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe is in the very back of your brain. There's a mapping topographically of the visual fields onto the neurons in the occipital lobes of the back of your brain. Okay, this image is it looks kind of complicated, but don't be daunted by that. There's a lot of other things on this image besides the areas that pertain to vision. All I really want to point out is how these projections from the lateral geniculate body of the thalamus are mapped onto the cortex. Now, the area in yellow is showing you projections from the thalamus onto the occipital and temporal lobes and parietal lobes of the brain. And this is illustrating how much of the brain is devoted to vision. The green area are the projections of the visual fields. That's the map of the visual fields. And the yellow area on the outside of the cortex there is all the tissue that's devoted to processing this information so that you can tell where things are and what they are and so on. So vision is a big part of your nervous system. It's a big part of your processing of all kinds of information. And these areas are also involved in integrating vision with other sensory systems so that you can use them together. For example, if you're trying to localize a sound in space, so you're out in the backyard, you hear a bird, and you want to find out where the bird is, well, you use sound localizing systems in your brain, which give you clues as to where the bird is, and then you orient your vision to that spot to try to see the bird. And that integration of sound localization with a spatial model constructed by the visual system is very important in localizing objects in space. Another thing that you do, obviously, is you orient your body in space. And somatosensory information that comes in from the sensory systems in your body is integrated with visual information so that you have a coherent model of where your body is in space. So when you move your body, when you ride your bicycle, when you walk somewhere, you're going to be orienting your limbs, your trunk, and everything in space correctly with the things that you're seeing and also the feedback you're getting from how you're positioned by the somatosensory sensory system that's in your skin, your muscles, and your joints. This graphic, though, is just showing vision. So it's showing you the large areas that are devoted to vision in the yellow and green areas. Here you have one aspect of feature detection in the cortex. In this example, you've got a vertical line a small vertical line there in the box. You can see it. Under conditions of A, B, and C, and the firing rate of a neuron is perceiving that vertical line. Well, on the lines by itself, you have a firing rate there of approximately 30 or so. When the line is among other lines that are oriented randomly around it, you have a firing rate that's much lower. Presumably there's inhibition of perception of that line. Then when it's in the context where there are a number of other lines lined up with it, as if there's a group of vertical lines, you get a high firing rate, indicating that form is present in the visual field. By changing firing rates like this consistent with context of lines, we're able to discriminate objects within a space that has got background and foreground or multiple foreground elements. But we're able to present, the firing rate here is indicating there's a form here, there's a contour here, and it's indicated by a vertical set of lines forming presumably a shape. Your brain processes that and tries to then formulate a form out of this, or at least a line, and formulate that as part of the contour of an object. The neural systems in the occipital lobe of the cortex, area V1, are specialized for detecting lines, movement of lines, and the orientation of lines. There are cells in the visual cortex that will respond just to a line, say a horizontal line moving downward. If the line moves upward, the cells don't respond. They're specialized for the orientation of a line and its movement in certain directions. There are some cells that respond to oblique lines moving across a visual field from left to right, but will not respond to a vertical line moving across the field from left to right. In this way, your brain forms a composite of the forms that are out there and the shapes because of the line orientations of these objects and their contours. This is depicting a table here, and you can see that the lines have a certain orientation, so presumably there are sets of cells responding to this. Their composite behavior is interpreted by the brain as a perception of a table. I have a movie at the website, the course website, called Vision 1, and this movie depicts Hubble and Wiesel's research mapping the neurons that respond to line orientations. So go back to the website and check out that movie. Another important stimulus quality that allows you to detect forms is whether the form is in motion or not. And this is a very interesting aspect of perception. Obviously, it can't be shown in a static image on the slide here, but there's an excellent little movie at the website, the course website, that illustrates this, in which you see a Dalmatian dog moving in front of a background that has splotches like a Dalmatian dog. Well, just go see the movie, and once you see the dog moving, you'll understand immediately what the cues are to help you to understand that the perception of a form is also influenced by that form moving in space. Okay, now we're going to review the visual fields. Here we have a graphic depicting the visual fields. Now, the visual fields is a reference to this part of space in front of you that your eyes perceive. So as you're looking straight out at space, your visual fields are represented by the area that you can see of space in front of you. Now, this is divided in half. You probably don't have a perception of that, but your visual fields are divided completely in half right down the middle. And they're represented on the left or right hands, on the left of the right hemisphere of the brain. So you can see in this graphic here, there's a blue side on the right. And by the way, the lens will focus light on the retina, and the nerves will cross there in the middle at the optic chiasm, that's called, where they crisscross there, the blue and the red, or the blue and the orange. By a process of crossing over, the right side of the visual field is represented by the left hemisphere and the left side of the brain in the left occipital lobe. And you have precisely the opposite pattern, completely symmetrical, for the left side of visual space, being represented by the right hemisphere. Now, this is a very interesting thing. I mean, if you think about it, the fields are replicating generally what all the sensory systems do. You have a crossover from one side of the body to the other, just like you do in the motor system. As you may know, the left hemisphere controls the right side of your body. The right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. And here you have a reference to this in vision. The right side of the visual field is represented in the left hemisphere, and the left side of the visual field is represented in the right hemisphere. Now, in order to do this, there's a very convoluted crossing over that occurs at the optic chiasm. Half the field crosses over from each eye, and that enables each side of the brain to represent each side of the visual fields. This is a fascinating phenomenon. Of course, it could be organized other ways, but it's again replicating this idea that the left side of space, the left side of your body, is right hemisphere, the right side of space, and the right side of your body is left hemisphere. Now I'm going to go through what happens to the visual fields and what happens to perception when you damage different parts of this system. And it helps, I think, illustrate how the visual fields are represented in the occipital lobe and how you perceive the left and right side of space. Okay, this slide is a depiction of what happens when you damage part of the visual system. In this case, you've damaged the visual system right where that little black line is in the left hemisphere, right across the blue pathways. You can see it's after the optic chiasm, where the crossing over occurs. These are the pathways that are going to eventually be conducted all the way back to the occipital lobe. Well, what happens if you have a stroke there, a brain tumor there? The visual fields are affected in a very specific way. This is a very strong clue that's used to diagnose illnesses like this. So every neurologist studies how the visual fields are affected by lesions in different parts of the visual system. And here what you've got is a complete loss of the right side of space. So when you have a lesion there, because the left hemisphere is going to represent the right side of space, when you have a brain lesion there, you lose the right side of space. Now, you probably don't have any sense that you have a right side of space that's so carefully demarcated and represented in your nervous system, but it's there. Your brain is so good as integrating the left and right sides of space. I think most people just have a sense they have a complete field in front of them, that it's not divided in any way. But here, when you lesion part of the brain, you clearly see that it's divided. And so patients often, when they have this kind of lesion, have difficulty identifying with it because they can still see the left side of space, and when you're just missing the right side, when you're just blind for the right side of space, it's a very disconcerting sort of symptom for them because they have a representation of what they're missing. They know that things are over there. They just can't see them, and they don't expect to be blind in this way. I think most people, the common sense idea of blindness is you're completely blind, you don't see anything in front of you, or you're sighted. The idea that you could just be blind on one side of space is a pretty unusual concept for most people, and it's a new idea. But that's an example. Now you can begin to see how the visual fields are going to be mapped out and represented in the brain, and they're represented topographically like this, such that if you lesion the left hemisphere's pathway, you'll miss the whole right side of space. All right, let's see what happens when you damage another part of the system. You see here a little black line right behind the eyeball, the left eyeball. In this situation, part of the visual field that's going to be represented by the right hemisphere is not crossed over. And this produces the peripheral field loss that you see in the picture of the balloons. So you got to imagine that the part of space in the left side of space is going to cross over by the lens to the right side of the left eyeball, and that's the side that's going to be represented by the orange area in that eyeball, and then on the right side of space, the lens crosses over to the blue part for the right side of space, and that's going to be represented on the left eyeball by the blue area you see there. Well, the right eye can see a lot of this space, so the right eye can see pretty much the whole side on the right, as well as a part of the side on the left. And that part on the left that's not seen by the right eye is made up for by what's seen in the left eye. But here you've disconnected one eye. And so people that are missing an eye or have damage to an eye so that they can't see out of one eye have visual fields that look like this. Notice that the visual field is not split right down the middle, even though one eye has been disconnected. You have obviously one side that's been affected, but the one eye that's still intact still sees a lot of that side. It just doesn't see as far over as if you had two eyes. So this is the kind of visual field defect you have if you were to remove one of your eyes. Now, if you remove the right eye, you'd have just the opposite pattern that you see here, in which the person is going to have trouble seeing the most extreme right side. All right, what happens if you lesion and damage the optic chiasm, where the pathways cross over? Now you can see that arrow there in the black line is indicating there's lesion to the optic chiasm, where the two sides cross over. Now in this case, when you lesion where the two sides cross over, you're just going to get the crossing parts of the fields, which turn out to be just the middle parts being intact. So the outside parts of the fields are lost, and the middle part is intact. Now this is referred to as tunnel vision because you can see in the middle part of your visual field. A lot of people that have this disorder don't even know they have it, because you can see pretty well right in the center, and you see to the left or right pretty reasonably far. And of course, as you turn your head, you'll see an entire scene, similar to how you'd see it if you didn't have a brain lesion. Now, the common disorders that affect the optic chiasm like this are traumatic brain injuries, because when the head goes forward, say an automobile accident hits something, there are structures right there that shear right through the optic chiasm and damage it. The other thing that happens is, the other disorder that commonly results in this kind of defect is a pituitary tumor. A pituitary gland is right underneath this, and when the pituitary tumor gets large, it can compress and damage the optic chiasm and produce this kind of tunnel vision. If a neurologist tests somebody and they have tunnel vision, and they haven't been in an automobile accident recently, there's a good chance they have a brain tumor in that area. It's very unusual to have lesions generally in this area because this part of the brain is reasonably protected from damage, from trauma and strokes and things like that. And so if you develop the symptoms, it's pretty much an indication that there's a tumor growing there, and it's compressing the optic chiasm. Pituitary tumors they're not generally malignant tumors, even though they can produce death, if they get too large. They're usually operated on and taken out, and the person is supplemented with pituitary hormones that are synthetically made. The other things that happens with pituitary tumors, of course, is you have hormone, particularly growth hormone differences that produce odd growth rates. A lot of the people that have had pituitary tumors grow really large. They're really, really tall, big people. Like, if you recall, there was a wrestler in the recent past named Andre the Giant, and he had a pituitary tumor or some kind of pituitary dysfunction that produced his giant size. At any rate, the optic chiasm, though, is the place where the pathways cross over, and if you have a lesion there, it just affects the pathways crossing over, and so the peripheral fields will be lost, but the central field will be maintained, and that's referred to as tunnel vision. I now have a movie depicting somebody with a visual field cut. So go back to the course website and download a movie called Field Cut. It depicts somebody who's a painter, who's an artist, who developed a visual field cut, and he has a very pure cut. Now, the resounding feature of visual field cut is even though the person is blind on one side of space, they still know that things are over there. And in particular, this guy, he's an artist who still paints over the whole fields. He just has to turn his head and look at the fields rather than being able to see them naturally in front of him complete. At any rate, go to the course website, download a movie called Field Cut, and it'll tell you everything about a visual field cut. Now, I'm using the term visual field cut to describe that loss of one side of space that occurs from the lesion of the pathways in one hemisphere. Now we're going to move beyond the occipital lobe into higher order processing areas of the cortex. And in this regard, there are two major areas of the brain that are involved in processing visual information, aside from the occipital lobe. The first of these is the dorsal pathway, the pathway from the occipital lobe that goes up into the parietal lobe. This pathway processes where things are. So spatial maps, topographical maps of the world, topographical maps of your body, topographical maps of the space immediately around you, are all constructed and modeled in some way by these areas in the parietal lobe. And then you orient your body in space given the visual information that you're processing at the time. The second major stream of processing involves the ventral pathway. And the ventral pathway deals with what you're seeing. So when you see a picture of an apple, you say that's an apple. All kinds of memories about apples are associated with that visual image. And your awareness of what something is mediated by the temporal lobe areas that process visual information. And I'm going to go in more detail about those. The next thing we're going to do, and I also have a movie I'm going to show you, or you should see from the website, that illustrates these processing streams and what happens when you damage them in terms of your visual perception. Okay, so go to the course website, download a movie called Vision 2, and it will explain, using the scientists who identified these things, it will explain the processing streams for vision in the parietal and temporal lobes. Now I'm going to describe a study that I did that examined figural memory or visual memory. And it's an fMRI study, so we put people in the scanner and we had them try to remember these kinds of figures, these kinds of forms. And later when they were taken out of the scanner, they had to they went through these figures and some distractor figures that were not shown to them, and they were asked to indicate which ones they had seen before. Well, this is a classic task that involves the where system. Even though it doesn't look like it's involving where much, it's obviously not involving what, because these are sort of nonsense figures that don't have names, don't have any memories associated with them. But whenever you engage in a two-dimensional, three-dimensional spatial array, you're trying to remember it or trying to process it, you're going to be involving the where system that's up in the parietal lobes. So I'm hypothesizing that when I get done with my study, the areas of the brain that were active will be areas of the brain in the parietal lobe. In the next slide, we'll see the results of my study. All right, here are my results. What I've done here is I've mapped the cortical activation on a schematic of the brain here, so you can see where the areas were active. So the bottom is the left hemisphere, the top is the right hemisphere. Now notice when you look at the two images, the occipital lobe in the back is very active because they were looking at pictures and they were trying to remember them. If you look elsewhere in the images, you see that the parietal lobe at the top, is active. So the where system has been activated by this task as you've tried to map where the lines are on the form and try to remember them and process them as a two-dimensional graphic. And when you do that, most of that processing is done in the parietal lobe after it's initially perceived and processed by the occipital lobe. And you see there's a red area here in the parietal lobe, a red area in the occipital lobe, all consistent with what's generally known about how visual information is processed. Now this is going to be an example of a disorder that involves a lesion of the right parietal lobe usually, in which the person has a neglect of the left side of space. Over the course of evolution, the right hemisphere has been specialized for processing spatial information. The left hemisphere is specialized for language information. So the right hemisphere is going to be mediating the spatial model that you construct in order to orient your body in space, in order to solve spatial problems like figure drawings and things like that. And when you have this syndrome, the person neglects the left side of space. They neglect the side of space that's opposite to their lesion site. The right side of space is usually represented because the left hemisphere still has enough processing ability in it, in the left parietal lobe, to represent the right field. Okay, so you have a map here of the fields. When you have neglect, you tend to neglect, you have a right hemisphere lesion, and so you're going to be neglecting the left side of space. And I'm going to go through some case examples of this to show you what this syndrome is like. Back when I was a graduate student, I evaluated a patient that had a large right hemisphere tumor, and she had a very pronounced left visual field neglect. She had some other symptoms that were very interesting and I think illuminate the kind of spatial distortion that occurs with this. She was a lady that played golf every Thursday, one day a week, with a group of friends. And her friends noticed that she was arriving at the golf games and her clothing was awry. It wasn't inside out or backwards or anything, but it didn't seem to be set on her body correctly, as if she couldn't dress as well, as if she was not aware that her, the clothing on the right side of her body was sort of bunched up, or maybe the buttons weren't buttoned completely symmetrical. And she would play golf, and she'd get up on the tee, and she'd knock the ball, down the fairway like you're supposed to do. And then she'd get in the golf cart and just drive off in a random direction, not seeming to have any idea where the golf ball was. Well, her friends thought this was strange, and they finally got her to be evaluated. And when she went in to be seen by the doctor, a computer tomography scan revealed that she had a very large brain tumor in the right frontal lobe of her brain. It was growing into the parietal lobe. And when I saw her, she was a very pleasant lady. Her language was fine, her memory was fine, but she had this very specific, unique visual spatial neglect. Okay, well, I've described some of the symptoms of neglect, and here we have some of them listed. In her case, she had prominent body schema disturbances. And I'll talk about body schema disturbance in a later part of the course when I talk about somatosensory perception. But this body schema disturbance is coming because her spatial model of her body has now been distorted by the presence of the tumor. Her orientation of her body in space relative to external space has also been disturbed. Well, the practical consequence of something like that is you have trouble dressing your body. You don't know exactly where your limbs are, and so your orientation of your clothing to those limbs will be disturbed. It'll be awry. And that inability to dress correctly is referred to as dressing apraxia. People also have a disorientation of right and left, as you might imagine. It's hard enough when you have an intact parietal lobe. Imagine if your parietal lobe gets damaged, how tough it's going to be to discriminate right from left. People have an agnosia for body parts, and what that refers to is they have a lack of knowledge or understanding of body parts. That sometimes they even don't believe the body parts are theirs. So it's not uncommon for patients with a right hemisphere lesion and left neglect to believe their left arm and leg actually belong to other people, because they're now dissociated from them. They don't have a body schema or a model of their body that includes those limbs anymore, because they're essentially disassociated from the spatial model. And finally, they have anosognosia. It's a fancy term for a denial of illness. Now, most people, when you think about it, if you get a right hemisphere stroke and you lose your spatial orientation, unless you took a course like this, you would not know that your right hemisphere was mediating spatial orientation. For all you know, everything's intact and everything's working normally. And that's how patients with these disorders, that's how they behave. They don't behave as if they have some kind of an impairment. It's quite a subtle thing if you think about it. I mean, even though we're extremely good at vision and our spatial models are very well developed, most of that is implicit. We don't actually have to think much about it. It happens naturally, ordinarily, as a part of our great brain processing of vision. Well, if you get a brain lesion and you have a loss of this ability, then you kind of realize what it is and where it is, and things that you took for granted before about such simple things as just ordering your body in space are now going to be disturbed. Well, people with this syndrome have that kind of neglect of space and a distortion of space that's caused by that. Now, if you look at these drawings here that were made by this patient, the first one there is a triangle. And you can see the triangle. Now, what she was asked to do was draw a triangle, a simple triangle. Now what she's done is she's overwritten the lines. She's drawn around and around and around this triangle. That's a common symptom of a lesion of the frontal lobe, and that's referred to as perseveration. That's not really a right parietal lobe lesion, or consequence of a right parietal lobe lesion. That's consequence of the frontal lobe lesion that she also had. Now, if you look at the other drawings, the drawings on the right, the top three, are supposed to be drawings of a square. And you can see she has trouble drawing a square. It's pretty much impossible. You also notice that there's a tendency to compress the square into one dimension. Finally, at the bottom, you have a drawing that's referred to as the Greek cross. And the bottom drawing is just supposed to be a cross. And you can see where she left out the left side, especially the bottom part and the bottom part of the extension on the left side. It doesn't really look much like a cross at all. Well, this is a manifestation of her left neglect. She's neglecting the left side of space, and so drawing parts that are in that side of space are left incomplete. Here are some further drawings of the patient. Now, what I have in the bottom left there is the correct drawings, more or less. What these figures should look like. These are drawings from a well-known memory test. If you look at the first drawing up there in the top left that she made, it's not that far off the drawing that's in the bottom left over there, but that's a pretty simple drawing, and she's distorted it spatially so that it doesn't have the proper symmetry. The drawing on the right there is showing perseverations. She's repeating parts of the drawing, and you can see where the left side of space is being neglected. So she prefers everything over on the right side of space. And the figure at the top, you notice that there's incomplete form on the left side of that space. The figure at the bottom is very interesting. It shows you that figure at the bottom is actually two figures. That the patient is shown the pictures, they're taken away, and then they're asked to draw what they just saw. Well, notice that she's left out, on the left side, she's left out a complete figure. Then on the right figure, she's left out the left side of that figure. So the left side of the right-sided figure has been neglected, and the figure on the left generally, this whole display of figures, has been neglected. And so this person is preferring the right side of space and neglecting the left. Now, it's important to distinguish this from visual field cut or blindness. This is not blindness. People with this disorder, in a sense, know there's things on the left side of space, but they can't represent them in their spatial model. And so space becomes distorted, and the left side gets neglected. Things that are over on the left side are considered sort of non-space. And it's not as if somebody has a model of space that includes that. They don't even have that model. And so for them, the left side of the world just doesn't exist. Here's some further drawings and writing by the patient. Now, the thing you should notice about this is that the writing is more or less intact. Writing, even though it's a spatial task, becomes so implicit and routinized in our production of it that it loses its processing by the parietal lobe. You can see where her writing is relatively fluent, the letters are formed well, and things actually seem to be spelled correctly and so on. In the middle there, she's asked to draw a clock. And when she's asked to draw the clock, it's distorted in space, but not that dramatically distorted. It could be far worse than that. But there's obviously a distortion, and when she tries to write the numbers, 11 through 0, she has some trouble with the spatial distortion. This isn't too bad, though. This indicates if all I had was this drawing alone, I don't think I can make a diagnosis that the person had neglect. But it does show that nice contrast, I think, between writing and other spatial copying, things like that, other spatial abilities. And then when you do things that are routinized, like draw a clock, you tend to rely on age-old patterns of drawing such a thing, and you don't have to invent new ways of drawing right there when it pertains to a clock. Now we'll review an interesting aspect of neglect that was studied by Biziash and colleagues who are from Italy, and they studied whether or not neglect exists in your imagination as well as in your perception. As you think about it, you have a system in your brain which is poorly understood, but a system in your brain that allows you to do visual imagination. So you can reconstruct in your mind's eye visual imagery that you've seen before, and you can actually combine things in ways that you actually didn't see before. So if I ask you to think of a purple horse, you can do that. If I ask you to think of a pink elephant, you can do that. You can have all sorts of combinations of visual perception in this imagery system, and it's an incredibly powerful tool for adapting to the environment, because you can actually imagine solving problems, in your visual imagination, and then you can use that problem solving that you've done in your mind to actually apply to visual objects in the environment. Well, the question was, does visual neglect, like I've described with my case, does that neglect also exist in imagination? Or is it just a property of perception? And so they developed a very eloquent, simple way of testing this that is one of the best methods that's ever been designed in neuropsychology. What they had the patients do is imagine in their minds walking toward the square of Milan. And these were people that all lived in Milan. They knew what the buildings were along the way and the shops and things. And they asked them, okay, imagine walking to the square of Milan from a certain location in your mind, and tell me what you see as you walk along. And what they discovered was that when people were walking along toward the square of Milan, they described all the shops and businesses that were on the right side of space, on the right side of the street. They didn't describe any of the buildings that were on the left side of the street. Well, then they had them go to the square of Milan in their mind and then turn around and walk back. And when they turned around and walked back, the people mentioned all the shops and businesses that they had not mentioned before, because now all of these shops and businesses were on the right side of their visual imaginary space. So that was very strong evidence that neglect exists in visual imagination as well as in visual perception. And there are a number of other theories that coincide with this. Basically, the current idea or theory is that the same parts of your brain that you use in perception are also used in imagination. So if you have neglect in perception or a defect in that system, it will be manifested in imagination as well as in perception. Now, you should also notice that perception and imagination, when you're in your waking state, are never confused. You very rarely do have any kind of confusion or ambiguity about something you see versus something you're imagining. But I'm sure you've all had the experience of waking up from sleep and having a little bit of confusion there, whether or not a dream was real or not, whether or not something that was in your imagination was also in your perception. At any rate, this was a very eloquent, simple procedure for showing that, and gives strong support to the idea that imagination and visual perception use the same parts of the brain. Now I would like you to go to the course website and play a movie called Visual Neglect. It depicts a woman with visual neglect, and they give her some things to look at and some things to draw. And I think you'll get a much clearer picture for what this phenomenon is like. Now we're going to go back to the concept of streams of processing in vision, and we're going to turn our attention to the ventral pathway in the temporal lobe. Now again, the ventral pathway is designed to process what things are, and so it either stores memories about visual forms and what they are, or it gives you access to information about that. But if that area is lesioned and damaged, and we'll go through some cases in which that's occurred, you lose your ability to understand what visual forms are, even though you can see them. And so people can look at an apple and have no idea what it is, even though they can pick it up and throw it or eat it. Although I guess if you didn't know what it was, you probably wouldn't try to eat it first. But you can operate on it because you can see it. You know where it is, but you don't know what it is. You don't know that it's called an apple, even though you know what apples are. You don't know that it's a object that you eat, even though you've eaten them before, because that information has become disconnected from the perception of the apple. Okay, well now we're going to go through this with some interesting cases, and you'll get a real clear idea, I think, what this process is like. All the disorders that are associated with lesion in this area are referred to as agnosias. Okay, you can have an agnosia for just about any visual perception. You can have agnosia for body parts, parts of your body you don't recognize. You have an agnosia for your fingers and what they are. You can have an agnosia for common objects like apples and flowers and bicycles And what this means is that you see a bicycle, you perceive it, you know where it is, but you've lost the connection between that perception of the bicycle, the visual form of it, and memories about bicycles. And so your perception is there. You can operate on the bicycle, but you don't know what it is. Now, of course, not knowing what an object is really constrains what you can do with it. You don't think about eating the apple because you've forgotten that apples are something you eat, or you've lost the connection between that memory that apples are something you eat and the perception of an apple. So you can see where it's going to constrain your competence with objects, but your ability, where an object is still completely intact. And you can think of this as, well, you have a visual perception of an object in which the memories about that object have been disconnected from the perception. Now, the formulation of these connections and memories is done in the ventral stream of processing visual information. So either the memories themselves are there, or there's systems there that access memories that might be stored in other places. But at any rate, when you have a lesion there, you lose the ability to connect perceptions to memories. Now, this is a special case here of a movie, prosopagnosia, which is the inability to remember familiar faces. And you're going to see where this guy has a very special defect in recognizing familiar faces. So he'll see people that he knows all about, like his wife, and be unable to recognize her by perceiving her face. If she speaks to him, though, he's able to recognize her. And that shows you that the connections between auditory processes and these memories are still intact, because they're in a different place in the brain. But the visual connections have been broken. So he can recognize his wife from her voice, but cannot recognize his wife from seeing her. At any rate, go to the course website, watch this movie. It's very compelling and a very interesting depiction of a visual agnosia. Okay, now we're going to play a little game. We're going to try to figure out which system was fooled. The ascending system up in the parietal lobe, where you tell where things are, or the descending system in the temporal lobe, where you tell what things are. So now we're going to go to the course website and play a movie called Room, and try to figure out which system was fooled. It's basically depicts an optical illusion in which one of these systems was fooled. And you can kind of it's somewhat a little bit ambiguous. I think you can make an argument maybe for, both systems maybe or something like that. But primarily one system was involved in the misperception of this room you're going to see in the movie. So go there, watch the movie, and try to figure out which system was fooled. Okay, again, just like the previous movie, we're going to try to figure out which system was fooled. The ascending system in the parietal lobe or the descending one in the temporal lobe. Now go back to the course website and play the movie called Visual Attention, and try to figure out if one system more than the other was fooled by the illusion or by the visual mistake, essentially is what this movie depicts, the visual imperception that's associated with this effect. Which system is involved? And I think by trying to think about this, it will help clarify, perhaps in your mind, how these two systems work as you try to make an argument for each one being fooled by the experimental manipulation.